All right. Well, hello, everyone. As always, welcome to the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. I can't believe we're already at the second last one, and I also can't believe that we're already into August. As always, I am your host, Eric Story. I'm the Outreach Manager at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada in Waterloo, Ontario, as well as a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the extensive history of the land in which the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada resides. Our office is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. It is encompassed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples in 1701 and the Haldimand Proclamation signed between the Haudenosaunee and the British Crown in 1784 following the American Revolution, which promised to the Haudenosaunee lands that extend 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from its source near Orangeville to Lake Erie. Today, this treaty territory remains the homeland of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. Acknowledging the history of these two nations' presence and relationship to the land since time immemorial, and through 300 years of treaty making is a reminder that they remained the original stewards of the lands and waters upon which the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada resides. For the last 3 months, you have all tuned in to learn about some of the broader themes in the history of Canada and the Second World War. As many of you already know, in the first half of the series, those themes largely revolved around the military history of the war. We explored the war through the air, in the sea, and on the ground. And on the back half, we have been exploring the social history of the war through the eyes of individuals. And I think a great presentation was had a couple of weeks ago with Scott Sheffield in his discussion of First Nations experiences during the Second World War. Tonight, we will continue to learn about Canada's role in the Second World War through individual experiences. But we will also hear about how the war was remembered and how museums play a role in constructing memory of past events. But before I turn it over to our speaker this evening, I have just a brief message from one of our sponsors. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the Dieppe Raid, the Juno Beach Centre Association just launched its newest postcard campaign titled, "He Lived Where You Live." Since 2019, the JBCA has mailed over 400 postcards to homes across Canada that share the same addresses of the many Canadians who perished at Dieppe. Each postcard shares the name and story of a Dieppe soldier who lived there at the time of his enlistment. To learn more about this campaign, visit www.junobeach.org to view their interactive map of where the postcards have been sent. And please reach out to the Juno Beach Centre if you receive a postcard. And I'll make sure to share the specific link to you of where you can look for that interactive map. It's a very, very cool campaign. The JBC is also offering all attendees of today's webinar 10% off all of their Dieppe-themed commemorative items in their online store using the code Dieppe80. Again, I'll share that with you so you don't have to memorize it now. But this code is valid until the 20th of August, so 10 more days. Today's webinar attendees can save on books written by some of the leading Canadian historians and writers of Dieppe, such as Mark Zelke and David O'Keefe, while also supporting the Juno Beach Centre. Now, before I turn things over to our speaker, I have 2 brief reminders for our audience, as I always have for you. First of all, you can turn on closed captioning by clicking on that CC button located at the bottom of your screen if you're finding it difficult to hear. And second, if a question comes to you at any point during the presentation, please just feel free to enter it into that Q&A function, again, located at the bottom of your window. And when you do share your question with us, please do let us know where you're coming from, because it's always just a ton of fun to know where our audience is tuning in, hopefully across Canada, but also hopefully across the world, because that's always the most fun. Now, without any further delay, I would now like to introduce your speaker for this evening, Eve Vaillancourt. Mary Eve is the exhibition's director of the Juno Beach Centre. She holds a history BA from Carleton University and a Master's of Education from the University of Caen. She began her career working with the educational services of the Canadian War Museum, and since 2001 has led the Juno Beach Centre's Summer Institute, which is a battlefield study tour for Canadian educators. Her presentation tonight is entitled Dieppe 80 Years After, the Juno Beach Centre's exhibition From Dieppe to Juno. Mary Eve, you take things away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eric. So I'll begin sharing my screen with you in just a second. Here we go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you tonight. So you're going to get a sort of a guided tour, a walkthrough, a curator's tour of our exhibition called From Dieppe to Juno, and walk you through the steps in creating the exhibition and some of the challenges that we faced. So beginning with obviously our exhibition and partner sponsors that we thank, and we were lucky enough to have the War Heritage Institute to collaborate with us on this exhibition. It's basically Belgium's Canadian War Museum, essentially. So a great institution to partner with on creating this exhibition and making sure it's available to European audiences, as the Juno Beach Centre is located in France, as everyone knows. So one of the challenges of this exhibition was creating something that would give justice to the place that it occupies in Canadian military history. This quote is probably one of the biggest inspirations for creating the exhibition. The shell stones at Dieppe, some the size of a small fist, offer unsettling sound as they rub against each other. Footing is poor, the rocks move with pressure. The memory of Dieppe is like these stones layered upon each other, shifting unsteadily and disquieting. This is unsettled history, and yet it also dominates. The memory of Dieppe overshadowed the story of Canada's Second World War for much of the 20th century. So Tim Cook wrote that fairly recently, and it guided a lot of the creation of the exhibition. As anyone has ever been to the Dieppe beaches, they offer that spectacular, unique experience. So in doing research for the exhibition for over a period of a year, we were deep into the contents and trying to make sense of how we were going to present this to, first of all, a European audience. And we wanted to make sure that we would expose all the layers of the Dieppe Raid. And one of the things that became really apparent was that there were ripple effects with the Dieppe Raid in time that continued to live and exist way beyond the 19th of August, 1942. The third thing that really guided the exhibition was quotes. The plurality of voices involved with what we call the voices of Dieppe in the exhibition. So as such, we decided to divide up the exhibition with a firm stronghold in setting up a context from 1940 to 1942. The raid itself, which is entitled The Plan and the Slaughter. The third zone is propaganda. The fourth is captivity, which thanks to some really good conversations with the Canadian War Museum, we were advised to really dive into that topic that's less explored relating to Dieppe. And of course, the greatest challenge of the exhibition was to explain a failure such as Dieppe in a site of victory such as Juno Beach, which I'll dive into. So obviously the exhibition is made up of the usual anchors that exhibitions are comprised of. one of the challenges in telling the story to your European audience, such a Canadian story, was that we needed to begin the exhibition with the notion that this is a story you're telling to people who know nothing about the Dieppe Raid. So that's something that's going to come up again and again, you know, that logic of what is it when you tell the story to people who know absolutely nothing about it. So essentially, to make it clear in Europeans' minds, Dieppe is our Verdun, Dieppe is our Gallipoli, Dieppe is our first day of the Somme, Dieppe is, I'll go over the losses just to be clear again, where we experience 60% losses, sometimes ranging up to 80% losses. So out of the 4,963 Canadians who went, only 2,210 returned to Great Britain, of which 568 were wounded, 1,946 were made prisoners, 100 of them died of wounds, and of course 907 died of wounds, just to recall the facts here. So one of the aspects that was clear in our minds in creating the exhibition was that we were going to have to move visitors through a series of hurdles, which are namely the reasons for carrying out the Dieppe Raid, appeasing Soviet dictator, forcing German reinforcements to keep them maintained on the coastal area of the Atlantic Wall, drawing out the Luftwaffe, responding to American pressure, carrying out actions towards empire building, testing enemy defense, combined operation techniques, including the destruction of heavily defended water ports, raising Allied morale. It's a propaganda raid, of course, gathering intelligence to support the naval intelligence war, and of course, pinching operations during raiding. So trying to move through all of this dense content was a challenge, and we exposed it in zone 1 of the exhibition in the context where we try to bring depth, first of all, by really making it clear that this is something that's signed by combined operations, and that reality being that we have the 3 arms, Navy, Air Force, and Army, combined together, which is a notion that most visitors don't understand. So we were after making sure people would understand that the Dieppe Raid is not an isolated event, that it follows a certain logic and a strategy given a specific context, which is that of the Atlantic Wall and the Battle of the Atlantic. So one of the challenges we had was to make sure we matched each main figure with marking quote. This one is for Churchill, of course, who as early as 1940 is already calling out on operations that he calls butcher and bolt policy, or hit and run on the Atlantic Wall. And this is a context at the time which is heavily tied to the Battle of the Atlantic and the Atlantic Wall. The Dieppe Raid doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not simply a raid to, it's more than just hurling a bunch of infantry alone against giant cliffs. It's based on a logic where there's been success in previous raids of smaller sizes, namely Bruneval raid and Saint-Nazaire raid in the spring of 1944. So when we set out to plan Dieppe, which I'll talk about later, there's this confidence with combined operations and this need. But furthermore, what's important is to realize that it's tied to the Battle of the Atlantic, and this graphic that we used in the exhibition is quite telling. You see the losses that we incur. Merchant ships that were hit by U-boats are in gray, and the number of U-boats sunk during the period of 1942 is abysmal. So what drives the rating is that this is key. And in understanding this aspect of the Battle of the Atlantic, one can understand the importance of the naval intelligence war, where during raiding, some intelligence material can be captured. We'll recall at the time that of 1942, which is the darkest year for the Allies, there's a period of a blackout that lasts from February 1942 to October 42 during the Dieppe Raid as well, that makes these losses so staggering at the time. So there's a real fear and pressure to capture intelligence material, and we wanted to make sure that this was clear in visitors' minds. So with that, we set out to make sure that people understand as well the thinking behind some of the senior leadership with the Dieppe Raid, essentially Lord Louis Mountbatten, of course, and Harry Crerar. So for Mountbatten, my responsibility was to prepare for the invasion, and in the meantime, I was to carry on with the commando raids, the invasion being the landings that for final victory, to keep our offensive spirit alive, learn the technique of landing on the enemy-occupied coast, and keep the Nazi on the qui-vive. And then for Crerar, we chose to take in some of the perspective of perhaps Canadian pride and Canadian willingness to participate. It will be a tragic humiliation if American troops get into action before Canadians who have been waiting in England for 3 years. And then what we really wanted to do in that plurality of voices I was talking about is make sure that not just senior leadership is exposed during the exhibition, but also your common soldiers. So here we have the advice of a British commando to a Canadian gunner of the Royal Canadian Artillery, who says, I've been on several commando raids, and you want to pick your spot on the landing craft, either be among the first 5 men to get off or the last few men. If you're in the first few, the enemy seems to be taking aim before they open on you. If you're in the last few, it seems about that time they're either changing magazines or getting fresh ammunition, and the last 3 or 4 men always seem to get away scot-free. This actually welcomes visitors into the raid section, so it's quite a brutal welcome for people to really understand the immensity of courage and dedication that is required to participate in such raids at the time. Of course, one of the things in making sure that this isn't just an infantry operation is showcasing again what is combined operations and how there's a naval component added to this raid, fairly small, mind you, compared to D-Day, and we'll see some of the figures later on. Same thing with the Air Force, the Royal Air Force that's assembled for the raid itself. Quite a large actual air battle that takes place, and the loss rate is actually higher for Germans at 5% and at 4% for the Allied Air Forces. So if you watch combined operations propaganda video, they focus much on the air component, and it does seem like there's some victory there. But again, it's a propaganda video. It spares you the horrors of the beach itself. Another thing we wanted to make sure that we would cover is the fact that the Dieppe Raid wasn't just Canadian, and we list all of the international representation of the units involved in the raid itself, being quite broad, and of course the Belgians being featured in the exhibition as well, thanks to our partnership. For the battle, the order of battle, of course, predominantly Canadians, as I've exposed prior. And what we were after in this section for the exhibition was to make sure that there was a clear distinction between those who planned the raid and those who fought in it, and not to oppose them or anything, but mostly to bring both voices and both perspective, bringing in the harsh reality of the fighting through extensive quoting. But of course, if we recall the objectives of the raid, it was to test defenses, destroy those defenses, those German defenses, take POWs, pinch or capture intelligence material. And of course, the reality unfolds very differently. The rigid plan makes it that there's some lateness and extreme difficulties in navigating and landing the Navy and landing the landing crafts in proper positions, which makes the tanks fairly late, the surprise effect being completely lost, and the infantry having no tank support until too late. And of course, the fact that there was no large component of artillery on the ships to bring in a varied gun support and guns of various sizes meant that on the beach itself, the infantry ended up being able to suffer the fire and unable to retaliate with close, naval coordination. So for the tank component, the total strength was 58, and those who could land was 27. I'm just gonna. We wanted to make sure that we would have some German impressions as well in the exhibition. So one that is quite striking is this one. As the landing ramps fell and the attackers sprang onto land, they met the destructive fire of 2 heavy machine guns. An inferno began, which was to last almost 3 hours. In our post, 2 young soldiers who had only been here a few days threw up constantly. It was their first action. We were amazed at the attacker who fought with bravery against an opponent who could not be seen, taking cover behind their dead comrades. They shot uninterruptedly at our positions. Thus, with their bodies, these dead soldiers provided their comrades with the last service of friendship. So I think that based on that quote, the Germans were equally as shocked as the Canadians in certain cases. So the brutal losses after this are comparable or compared in the exhibition to give a sense to visitors, especially British ones who know the brutality of the Somme. In that respect, it's basically you end up with the amount of losses at Newfoundland, with the Newfoundland Regiment at Beaumont Hamel, compared with a similar case, which is a Royal Regiment of Canada, the worst hit of all the 3 beaches. You end up with 94% loss rate with the Royal Regiment of Canada, and back in 1916, you had a loss rate of 85% with the first day of the Somme, July 1st. So that gives people a strong impression of the brutality of the raid. Now, some artifacts that were quite a challenge to get inside the exhibition was a Spitfire Engine, but that was something that we felt really strongly about, making sure that it would give visitors a sense of the size of some of the aircrafts involved, and basically making sure that the Air Force component would have much visibility as well in the exhibition. Another really neat artifact that we were able to get from the Canadian War Museum was the pigeon message that was sent by Lieutenant Colonel Macbeth after after the orders were given to abandon and retrieve. So that leads me to our third section, which was on propaganda. And I'll take the time to read it again because this informed a lot of our thinking for that section of the exhibition. A close look at the communication strategy of Combined Operations Headquarters concludes that overall, the story fed to the newspapers had been written in advance, regardless of the raid's outcome. So clearly with Dieppe, where the reality becomes, the propaganda becomes inseparable from facts, the heroism that was focused on in newspaper was the key at the time, as the numbers of wounded were not used as evidence of the failure, but rather were used as evidence of heroism. So knowing that the outcome was set or determined in advance, it was clear that from then, hopefully visitors would understand the importance and the ripple effect of the propaganda during and immediately after the Dieppe Raid and the years after as well, and during the war years. Of course, there was a number of journalists present. Ross Munro was one of them. He probably applied a certain amount of self-censored, even though there was censorship at the time. Most Canadian journalists didn't really need those strict rules in place to apply their own self-censorship. And the way he describes it is definitely in line with that thinking that it had to be presented from a positive perspective to the Canadian public. Dieppe was a disaster and a triumph. It was a defeat and a conquest. It was tragic, yet it brought forth such shining gallantry from 5,000 Canadians new to battle that their courage and audacity electrified the world's free people. Dieppe became a watchword for gallant conduct on every Allied war front. He said that in September of 1942. One of the things that also was really important to us was giving voice to those who hadn't been heard before, especially families, mothers and wives. The long list, as you can see in the slide, of the dead, the wounded, the missing, the prisoners of war was a shock to the Canadian public, while at the same time, Toronto men played full part in the historic battle. So the confusion for the public, where the lists do not match what is happening, what happened at the Dieppe Raid, creates even more angst in the Canadian public, as is recounted by this mother of 2 children and the wife of a soldier who is gone missing. And she's informed that he's been killed in action and is utterly confused. So it was really important to place back visitors into that perspective as well. The losses are staggering, and it's really quite something to see those kinds of figures where you have in the space of a single day, towns that are hit with 228 war dead. In Toronto, for instance, Hamilton even more so with 582. If we all recall some of the war dead coming from the war in Afghanistan, if this was to happen in Canada today, it would shock the Canadian public completely. This is a really telling artifact that we were lucky enough to get from the Essex and Kent Scottish Regimental Museum. Those are crowds gathering to listen to Ross Munro addressing the public. At the time, the news were scarce, and first-hand accounts of the battle, such as Ross Munro could give, were quite rare, so crowds gathered. There was other events similar to these elsewhere in Canada, one namely in Parc La Fontaine in Montreal that gathered up to 4,000 people who listened to Ross Munro as well. One of the other aspects that we cover in the exhibition quite at length is the perspective of the French population during the raid. Basically, the French were living under the fear of retaliation from the Germans at any given point. They were given the choice, life decisions they had to make was between basically resisting the enemy and facing eventual deportation or execution. Collaborate, of course, which for many was not an option, and try to remain in hiding or neutral was a third option. So we have to recall that during the Dieppe Raid, there was actually 46 civilians who were killed, mostly because of the naval bombardment and the aerial bombardment and the debris and the fires that raged. The city was fairly destroyed during the raid as well. So this is definitely a time for the French population where they are really thinking that this is it. This is final liberation or the beginning of the liberation. Without having the benefit of hindsight, of course, these people are really hopeful that this is the beginning of the end for them. And it's not. There's an instance in the exhibition where we showcase a conversation between a Canadian soldier and a small child. And he promises her to be back. I think it's something that is really underappreciated with the Dieppe Raid is the French perspective. And especially when it comes to the reprisal that they feared as they encountered Canadian soldiers themselves. So one of the things that is really quite shocking and that we kept in mind in presenting the exhibition to a European audience, especially a French one, was the maneuver of Hitler, who actually wanted to thank the French population for not having helped the Canadians during the raid. And he offered to the mayor of Dieppe at the time the sum of 10,000 francs as a reward. The mayor, who was obviously not trying to collaborate with Vichy France and Hitler, refused that sum of money. He didn't want it. And instead, he negotiated the return of Dieppe prisoners of war from the fall of France in 1940. As such, what ended up happening was that as soon as September 1942, Dieppe saw the return of its prisoners of war from France, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. One of the aspects that was really important too as well in discovering the far-reaching effects of the Dieppe Raid was how there was even propaganda fed to parts of occupied Europe, such as Lithuania in this instance, and Poland in this propaganda poster. Just to bring again, it was really important because we do get visitors from Germany to showcase some of what was said about Canadians from the German perspective. So I'll read through that. Most of them, speaking of the Canadians, are haggard men, not quite young anymore. Men with rough faces, athletic builds, who volunteered for the dangerous landing, the type of men you met in Port Town or a bar in the city or in the villages of the Canadian Midwest, and who terrorize peaceful citizens everywhere. In short, roughnecks and ruffians who don't know what to do with their excess energy. These boys aren't lacking in courage, but the hell on that beach at Dieppe proved too much even for their nerves. The war for England promised them easy money, pretty girls, adventure, and combat, of which they were not afraid, but not senseless and hopeless sacrifice, as described by German soldiers. So we're now into Zone 4, the Captivity. What ended up happening, of course, after the Canadians were marched through the town and displayed to the French population. The French population tried to help them, and they were hurtled away from the Canadians in most cases, actually, was the long trajectory towards some stalag camps across Germany and the Czech Republic, and as well as Poland, who are described on this map. The long route also took them to Momigny, which is in Belgium, where the car that they were stuffed in was stopped for 12 hours under a scorching sun to make sure that Canadians who had tried to escape the train were punished and especially shown to the Belgian civilians as what had happened to Allied soldiers early on in Dieppe. And of course, one of the lesser known aspects of the Dieppe Raid are the long years of captivity. In the process of carrying those Canadians to Germany, the Germans were quite aware of the divisions that existed in Canada at the time between the French and the English. And at one point in time, they actually separated the French Canadian soldiers from the English Canadian soldiers and made, there were some fences between them. This was a way to experiment with how much the hatred between French and English Canadians could arise. So they started to get some chocolates only to the French-speaking soldiers to try to get the English Canadian soldiers basically upset. But that didn't work. The experiment failed, and the French Canadian soldiers ended up giving the chocolates back to the Canadians to make sure that all could have some. So a beautiful moment of unity in Canadian military history to a certain extent. It should also be known that French Vichy government negotiated the return of certain French Canadian prisoners of war from the Fusiliers Mont-Royal. They did so in an attempt to show to the Quebec population specifically, which they wanted to seduce, that they were more lenient towards French Canadian prisoners of war than English Canadian prisoners of war. So that's another lesser known aspect of the Dieppe Raid covered in the captivity period. Of course, what's important to remember in this section of the exhibition is the psychological impact of captivity. It took a toll on the prisoners to be in that state for a number of years. And it should be noted, one thing that we made plenty clear in the exhibition, that the Dieppe Prisoners of War Association ended up lobbying the Canadian government for a number of years, only to gain compensation finally in 1976, yes, that late, into their fight for compensation for the psychological impact and also the physical impact of having been kept in captivity for so long. And of course, the death marches at the end of the war, in 1945, in the spring of 1945, which lessened their health incredibly as well. As quoted by a private, you can train a soldier to fight, you can train a soldier to accept death, but there is no way to prepare a soldier to be taken prisoner. The experience can only be understood by one who has been through the humiliation. Again, one of the voices that we give are to those who were kept in captivity and what they say to people back home. But what I'm missing the most are the letters. Tell the parents, the friends, fiancés of soldiers to write often and again every day. When we hope for letters that don't come, we have nightmares. We imagine a million things. Remember that it's the only thing we have left, a small piece of paper coming from home. It is so important. And of course, it brings us to another issue that is so emblematic of the Dieppe Raid. It's the shackling issue. We were lucky enough to get a pair of shackles from the Museum of the Royal Regiment of Canada in Ontario. Of course, what ends up happening is that Brigadier Southam of the 6th Brigade is found, taken prisoner and found with the orders to shackle any German prisoners they would bring back to England with them. And when the Germans discover this, they decide to retaliate. So the shackling of Canadian prisoners of war in captivity in Germany begins in September of 1942 and will end in November 1943. So that's 14 months of shackling every single day, which also had a psychological toll on the captives. There were the same that happened in Canada, although for a much shorter period of time, for 3 months. Some of you might know of the Bowmanville incidents, where a large German officer camp rioted for a period of 3 days against being shackled at the time. Some of the psychological effects too are described in the exhibition. It was evident in prison life too. The younger people seemed to be more affected by prison life than older people. And the boys, they would get into problems, they'd go around the bend. But the older people, you didn't find them going around the bend. They seemed to be able to live through it. So depending on your age and your ability to cope with the state made a difference. Okay, so I'm hoping to devote the last portion of my presentation to the remembering aspect of the exhibition, which is on memory, which draws its title, from Dieppe to Juno. Is there such a thing as a straight line between Dieppe and Juno Beach, or the Normandy landings? We dive into this and try to make sure that people come away with a broader perspective than just the typical explanation, which comes from Mountbatten, actually, who had famously said shortly after the raid that the lives lost at Dieppe ended up saving lives in Normandy. We try to bring context and depth to that in the exhibition, first of all, by showcasing the other raids, amphibious landings that took place around the world in 1943 and 1942, Operation Torch in North Africa, Operation Husky in Sicily, Operation Avalanche and Shingle as well, which bring about the Mediterranean victories in just before D-Day, which are crucial. Some of the lessons learned in these amphibious landings are crucial to making the D-Day landings in Normandy a success. So it's not such a simple path or simple explanation, especially when you go from a raid to a landing, which is meant to commence the liberation of Europe entirely and establish a bridgehead. A raid is, we remind visitors, a single-day operation, which happens over the course of a tide, whereas a landing, as we know, will establish, as I said, a bridgehead and establish a permanent foothold, which will bring an entire second front to Western Europe. So the numbers speak for themselves in terms of size and scope of the landings. It's really important to distinguish as such a landing and a raid. And one thing that came out very clear in the research of the exhibition that kind of kills away that theory that there's such a shortcut between Dieppe and Juno is that artificial ports were already in the thinking before the Dieppe raid. As early as the spring, April of 1942, Churchill is famously quoted for having commenced the thinking around resolving the issue of artificial ports, which would mean landings in Normandy, of course, because in Normandy you have no deep water ports, and the deep water ports, as we discover with the Dieppe raid, are too well defended to be taken entirely. So what are some of the lessons learned with Dieppe that actually have an impact on D-Day and Juno and Normandy? I would argue are much more tactical. They, apart from the artificial port being not really an argument because it precedes Dieppe, I would argue that they are tactical in terms of lessons learned. You have the need for a much closer tank and infantry coordination and a much closer artillery and infantry coordination, which we will see on Juno Beach and in the success of the first day of the fighting on June 6th, 1944. So that's something that was at the heart of the exhibition that we tackled early on, making sure that it was almost a propaganda piece. In fact, the Mountbatten piece about making this so-called lives lost in Dieppe saved lives in Normandy, which is something that's quite well known, actually. If there's one thing Europeans know about the Dieppe raid, is that it has a correlation with Normandy as a failed landing. But in fact, it's almost more like a propaganda piece from the Germans, who called it a landing and called it the failed second front so much that we ended up believing this. Another important aspect was Crerar, who is quoted again in the exhibition when he addresses officers on June 7th, 1944. Tragedy is heavy to bear with Dieppe, but its influence on Allied strategy and victory will become clear with time. So again, the relationship is got depth, and it holds water to a certain extent. But what we were after was making sure visitors would distinguish between a landing and a raid, and lessons learned would not be as simple as going from one to the next. Okay, so for basically the last bit of my presentation, we're diving into the memory of Dieppe and what it means 80 years after to remember Dieppe. One important healing moment is the famous return to Dieppe of Canadian soldiers in 1944 in September, which is a tremendous moment, especially for the civilian population, well, for Canadian soldiers as well as the civilian population, who are finally able to be liberated, this time for real. Unfortunately, as the Germans retreat, They capture some French resistance fighters and execute them in retaliation for the incoming Canadians who are successful in parading through Dieppe. So it's a bittersweet story there as well for the French civilians. And of course, one of the most moving artifacts for the last portion of the exhibition is this gift that comes from the prisoners of war of Dieppe, given to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division in September of 1944, which is quite beautiful and handmade, obviously. So those French prisoners of war, they did not like the fact that they got a free ticket home on the backs of 907 Canadians killed that day on 19th August. So they end up having a great sense of guilt and debt towards Canadian soldiers, which is a lesser known aspect of the Dieppe Raid. We really wanted to give justice to our French audience at the center. And this brings me towards the last bits of my presentation, hoping to save time for the Q&A and discuss this further with everyone here tonight. We wanted to make sure that visitors understood that it has occupied such a large place in our collective memory. This is something that was really dear to me in presenting on a large banner in the exhibition. The isolation that some of the French-Canadian veterans felt after the war. When we met at the Legion there, we only spoke about the war, something so common with any veterans, actually. But with civilians, no. Even when you want to tell something to a civilian who's never been, first of all, he won't believe you. Second of all, he'll tell you, you didn't have to go. I felt isolated. I think that speaks volume to how for years the Dieppe Raid was, especially in Quebec, even more problematic than in English Canada due to the conscription crisis, obviously. Since a really neat poster that shows in 1946 how the name of Dieppe is next to Falaise, Ortona, and Caen, as early as 1946, and then we jump to a panel, a protest sign that was used during a peace march in October of 2006 during the Pan-Canadian Day of Action. Troops out of Afghanistan, where Kandahar is presented as a suicide mission, as well as Dieppe and Beaumont-Hamel. And then finally, I think what speaks volume to the lack of recognition that Dieppe veterans felt until much later, much in recent years, is the fact that the Dieppe clasp was not added to the CVSM, the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, until 1991, which is, when you think about it, quite late. It should have been added a lot earlier than that. Of course, most Canadians now will be familiar with this extremely moving video, which I don't have the rights to show at this point tonight. But it's this famous Bell Canada advertisement from 2008. It shows an interaction between the grandson who's visiting the beaches of Dieppe and his grandfather back home. A great minute of advertisement that has been so popular that when we obtained the rights to showcase this in the exhibition, Bell Canada told us that it's been every year around November 11th, the members of the public asked Bell Canada to rerun it. It's so popular. Of course, they've created other videos. They can't showcase it anymore for different copyrights reason, but it's still found on YouTube, and it's something that has been a great addition to the exhibition. If visitors don't have time, if they watch this, they get it right away. So some last words. I chose two quotes here because as much as we try to promise, to the public what is the memory of Dieppe 80 years after, the result of doing this exhibition is that we're still, face to face with the limits of our abilities to offer explanations as to the Dieppe Raid. And I quite like this quote from Pierre Venat, whose father was killed at Dieppe. Was Dieppe a useless sacrifice? Modestly, I do not wish to answer. I would not want my father, who believed in his duty to be there, to have died unnecessarily. So I'll end with thanking some of our partners, some of the Canadian museums who helped us during the exhibition making process, who were there during the COVID pandemic to respond to our call for artifacts. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had so many incredible artifacts for this show. I can't name all of them right now, but they hopefully will recognize themselves. A bunch of military museums across Canada, small museums who were really instrumental. And I'll end with plugging one of our great resources meant for teenagers and schools and teachers that are dear to us and basically are available for diving into some critical thinking and analytical thinking about the Dieppe Raid. And I think that covers my 50 minutes. And I will let the question and answer period start. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thanks so much, Mary-Eve. That was just a fantastic presentation. I could tell how moved you were in doing this, in putting together this exhibit. And I want to actually ask you that first. But before I do, would you mind stop sharing your screen?
Yes, I can do that.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I want to get into that kind of the emotional aspect of this, because I think, some academics, and I think some classical academics, and I'm sure museum curators as well, like to say that, we need to be objective when we are putting together and doing our work. And we need to put our emotions aside in order to do that properly. And I know, and I don't think Alex would hate me too much to say that I know he gets emotional in doing this sort of work too. And I can say that I can get emotional in doing some of my work as well. And I don't think that necessarily means that it's not objective work. So I'm wondering if you could speak to kind of how emotions can affect the way that you put together these exhibits.
Well, for me, it was definitely a sense of duty. You see so much suffering, and I didn't share some of the more brutal quotes that we included in the exhibition, but you really get a sense of the suffering that happens, and you want to do it justice. You want to make sure that visitors feel as close as possible to the brutality of it all and what they had to face. So it gets to be emotional, but at the same time, you feel that sense of duty, I would say, more than emotions, that sense of remembrance. And of course, the exhibition isn't just emotions, it's a mixture of the two. We dive into the tactical and the strategies as much as we dive into the emotional content of those who lived it. And it goes back and forth between the two, I hope in a fairly balanced way. Yeah.
Mary Eve, how about I want to start off just by asking some kind of shorter questions to get those out of the way, and then we can kind of move on to some of the ones that will perhaps require a little bit more deliberation. So the first question actually came in from Nathan Hiller from Caledon. And I actually wrote down a similar question myself. And he was wondering about just the nature of Dieppe. Was that the reason why there was so much heavy armament that was kind of expendable and left at Dieppe? Like I noted here that 27 of the 58 tanks landed, which would be less than 50%. So perhaps you could explain, why not so many tanks are landing and why so much equipment was kind of just seen as expendable or left there.
I'll try to answer that in two parts. I'm not an expert like Alex on the tank issue at Dieppe, but I know that the navigational difficulties made them late. I understand that the disaster meant that it wasn't worth it to hurl more equipment and tanks at something that was already such a disaster, like reinforcing failure, basically. And then the retrieving of them was definitely impossible to remount on landing craft tanks that had been stuck in the chert in the famous stone. So I don't know if I can give justice to the whole tank battle right now, but I think based out of common sense, it's already difficult enough to re-embark some of the infantry and the men back there, that the tanks are just completely abandoned for sure. And then why not all of them land are likely due to navigational difficulties and the firing that's coming at the oncoming flotilla. And we end up with having tanks useful at least for providing cover for the infantry, which is as close as we get to a tank and infantry coordination on that day. Yeah.
I want to ask a little bit about kind of the behind the scenes work doing research and making decisions on kind of what historical theories are used and which ones are put aside. Because a number of people have asked about David O'Keefe's theory of Dieppe being a pinch raid. So I'm curious kind of what, and I'm kind of bringing a bunch of questions together here for you, Mary Eve. What goes into that process of researching the different competing theories and ultimately making the decision as to which ones you're going to showcase and which ones are perhaps put in the background or not used at all?
Okay, yeah. Well, this is a great question, and we spent a lot of time, trust me, debating and speaking with David, listening to him, having great conversations with him, and knowing just how hot of an issue it's become in Canadian military history. We were like, okay, what do we do with this? And at the same time, we must remain neutral. It's not like we can completely go all the way. We just need to present it. And this is what museums will do. Will present, a variety of explanations, and they will let visitors decide and choose. So we ended up opting for the option of showcasing, and I spent a lot of time tonight describing that and showcasing the infographics that went with it. But I think in my mind, with all the work that I've done, what David O'Keefe has been able to bring forth is the connection to the Naval Intelligence War and the Battle of the Atlantic. Is it a pinch raid? Was there an enigma? The Juno Beach Centre cannot say yes or no, but at the same time, we went way further than any other exhibition has ever gone on the connection with the Naval Intelligence War and the context of the Battle of the Atlantic. Like back when I first stepped foot on Dieppe Beach, which was back in 2001, there was no such thing in the discourse. And now with this exhibition, there's like a whole section about it. So it's not like we're trying to shove it aside at all. It's more like we want to construct something that makes sense to visitors. We even had an Enigma machine in the show itself. And, we didn't say there was an Enigma machine present or there was not. We just left it there to show this was what was so important and crucial during the Battle of the Atlantic. This was the machine that created the blackout that lasted for all these months in February to October 1942. Like, this is what museums should do, is stand and provide and let visitors choose. But I think we put a lot more emphasis than we would have before the work that David O'Keefe has brought forward. Yeah.
Moving on next to sources, Mary, I have a question from Dave Patterson from Kingston, from the Canadian Battlefields Foundation. He was curious about the French civilian testimony and where you were able to track those down, and if there is any kind of written records left behind from those French civilians.
We worked with the Archives de la Ville de Dieppe, who had prepared the city of Dieppe archives, and they had prepared a 2D exhibition on the Dieppe Raid from the civilian perspective back during the 70th anniversary. So we used all their research and sources. We also spoke with le Musée Mémorial of, what is it called again? Le Mémorial du 19 août, 19th August Memorial. And we spoke to the descendants of those who experienced the Dieppe Raid. So those were our sources, yeah. The museums in Dieppe itself. And we also had the help of some French collectors as well for some artifacts, but the testimonies mostly came from Archives de la Ville de Dieppe. And their sources were, a lot of them were INA, Institut National de Recherche de France. So basically Library and Archives Canada, but in France. Yeah.
Next question again regarding the exhibit, Mary, from Dave Alexander and Owen Sound. He posed the same question, I remember it, to the JBC panel at the Canadian Military History Colloquium earlier this spring. What do you hope the JBC's patrons will take away from experiencing this new exhibit on Dieppe?
I think, as I said during my presentation, that the Dieppe Raid isn't just infantry being hurled at giant cliffs. Like that this notion that it's just murder and it's senseless and it's stupid generals again, and you can blame it on like all of that usual business of not understanding military history. I think that by bringing depth, by bringing the need to do something, the need to act in 1942 in the desperate year of the war, like it should be seen as more than just a suicidal mission. And I think bringing the context of the Battle of the Atlantic and bringing the context of what combined operations is hoping to do, bringing the notion that the Dieppe Raid isn't an isolated event. It's a string. It's a continuous string of other raids that are successful, that leads combined operations to think that they can devote more means to this type of exercise. So again, it's bridging the worlds of civilians and military at the Juno Beach Centre. We welcome visitors who don't necessarily always come from, the military history perspective. And if you can bring depth to that, then they come out having a better appreciation as opposed to judging with hindsight, which is something, we always try to avoid in military history, of course.
To follow up on that, a question from Alma Calder. Have you had any feedback from Canadian soldiers, descendants of Canadians who fought at Dieppe, or even Canadians who did fight at Dieppe themselves on the exhibit?
I haven't been there myself on the ground to monitor this. I would have to ask the team in France. I know that so far comments received have been really positive. I know that Jane Poulton Turvey, who is the descendant of Jack Poulton, his daughter, is going with a group of Canadians who have connections to the Dieppe Raid. So we're really looking forward to welcoming more Canadian visitors and seeing what they think and how they feel in that exhibition, if it gives justice, and trying to go after so much, the German perspective, the French perspective, the Nazi occupied perspective. Like we go quite broad. We want to make sure that the Canadian story is told within all of this as well. So yeah, we haven't had a lot of Canadian visitors since the pandemic to bounce off of yet.
I'm going to take one of my questions and combine it with a few others too, about the clasp added to the service medal in the 90s, Mary-Eve. I'm curious, why did it take so long for the clasp to be added?
I don't know. I'll have to be honest. I don't know the full story behind that. I just know that it happened late, and I think if I recall vaguely, faintly from early research, this goes back almost 3 years ago now, that they asked for it and had to fight for it many times. So it's not like one day they woke up as a whole and said, we want this. It's more like pressure over time until it was finally awarded. I think there was something about the fact that you couldn't add, normally you would add like a campaign bar to the CVSM, not a single day raid to it. But the Dieppe veterans felt like they should have something like a campaign medal for it, and they didn't. Like you had the France-Germany star, you had the Italy star. They wanted something as big as that, so the Dieppe bar was sort of a compromise. But I'm not entirely sure. I don't know. This is just snippets from what I recall vaguely.
I've got a few questions about Ross Munro, the journalist that you featured in the exhibit. The question from Leo DeVoe is if you could speak a bit more about Munro's role in explaining the raid to Canadians. What sort of, who is he publishing for? What was he hoping to communicate about the raid, and how was he received?
He was a major figure, and he was really popular. I don't recall who he's publishing for off the top of my head, but he was definitely in demand and toured Canada immediately after he got back, and he was the closest to the action that there was a total of 9 reporters among all of them. Oh, Alex informs me the Canadian press. He reported for the Canadian press. Thank you, Alex, for being there. He basically was able to bring in the first-hand accounts, and he was speaking to also the soldiers who had gotten back to England and collecting, stories of bravery on the beach back from some of the men who were able to get off the beach. So he was seen as the guy with first-hand accounts of the battle, basically.
And what was his general view of Dieppe?
The quote that I used during my presentation, he he's nuanced about it. He says it's tragic, yet it's bravery, it's a conquest, and it's a failure. I think his view on it is that it's something quite noble, and it's nothing disgraceful or suicidal in any case. No.
I just saw an interesting question here from David McCarthy. And since you were kind of involved early on with the JBC's founding in 2003, his question is about whether there is ever any sort of discussions about having a permanent museum devoted to Dieppe, Canadians at Dieppe.
Well, I stepped in the JBC back in 2011. So I was not involved with the founding of the Juno Beach Centre. And given the difficulties that it is to run a Canadian operation that's independent and not for profit overseas, certainly the JBC's thought of having a second museum out there, but the perennity of ensuring the perennity of one museum is quite enough already, as it is. As everyone probably knows, the Juno Beach Centre is not a public museum; it's a private museum still. So you'd have to ask the Canadian government if they are thinking of establishing a permanent. It's a good time to ask them that question, actually, during the 80th anniversary, as they're about to go there with veterans themselves. And yeah, it's definitely our footprint in Europe begins with Vimy and goes to Beaumont Hamel and a very large amount of other places for the First World War. And for the Second World War, we're late in the game. We're definitely in the beaches of D-Day. We're already definitely the poor parent of D-Day, that's for sure. So if we get to Dieppe, Dieppe is the Beaumont Hamel of Juno for the Second World War. So it would be great to have a permanent Canadian footprint there, more than just a memorial or a cube or a living memorial, such as a museum with programming and temporary exhibitions would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to the exhibit, picking up on the propaganda zone that you guys have created. I'm curious how, because given the memory of Dieppe is largely dominated by failure in memory, I'm curious how much that propaganda machine early on in the newspapers actually had a demonstrable effect on the way in which Dieppe was understood and remembered, particularly after the war, if any at all.
Like later, much later after the war, or the immediate
just like even the immediate post-war period, or maybe even soon after the Battle of Dieppe, did propaganda have much of an effect on how Dieppe was remembered, or was it very quickly labeled a failure, and that's where that kind of the power of that memory remained?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think that the way that the story was fed to the Canadian public, in that it was a success and it was acts of bravery, and it definitely created a dissonance between the harsh reality. And as I showed those numbers, those pie charts, like seeing those kinds of results in the space of one day is just horrendous. It can't mean a success or a victory. So how that's evolved over time to become what we know today, that, it's the lessons learned emphasis that has taken up, like how we morph from that in the immediate subsequent years to later on, like lessons learned, which is becomes more important. I think it's our way of dealing with the tragedy, is making sure that it wasn't for nothing. And that's how it's remembered. That's how we remember Dieppe. And even that, we have to deconstruct that, which is what we try to do in the exhibition. Yeah.
A question from Mark Cube in Edmonton. He's curious if you have come across anything that indicates if the raid had any effect at all on Mackenzie King, or if he commented on it at all.
Yes, he did. He commented on it, saying how in his diary, we didn't include it in the show, but I recall seeing it. He mentioned horrendous casualties today, and sort of, how am I going to deal with that now, you know? Yes, definitely a huge impact there, but we didn't show it in the exhibition. It's just the toughest part, that's the challenge in the exhibition. You know, you got word counts when you're an undergrad, and then you have a graduate student, and so on and so forth. But in an exhibition, your word count is even more brutal. So, yeah.
I just want to follow up on that, because it kind of reminds me of the question, anyways, of how Robert Borden during the First World War, the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, was very moved by battles like the Second Battle of Ypres, Vimy, when he would visit soldiers and he would see them in hospitals injured, and it very much, in a lot of ways, didn't guide necessarily, but it certainly impacted some of his decisions.
Yeah.
Did you notice if that was something similar that happened with Mackenzie King, or was he, he's always concerned about internal divisions in Canada? Was he much more concerned about kind of preserving these, not preserving, but making sure that these divisions didn't play such an overwhelming role as it did during the First World War?
That's something that could be like a thesis topic. I think if anybody watching out there, it hasn't been done. And certainly with his diaries, you've got such an amazing primary resource. It's even been translated to French, I believe. So it could even be done by a Francophone academic. I didn't dive into that as much as I would have liked to, unfortunately. But knowing Mackenzie King and how he handled the conscription crisis, I can only guess or assume that because he must have been aware that the FMR was sent as a mistake and as a reserve unit, basically a unit sent to reinforce a failure to be captured in bulk part, must have been a huge nightmare for him to handle in terms of the divisions already existing in Canada. I know that for a number of years in Quebec, and especially in Quebec history books in the 60s and the 70s, the Dieppe Raid is presented almost as conscripts being sent to a suicidal mission, whereas in fact there's no conscription in place for overseas service at the time. So but yeah, I didn't dive into that vein enough to be able to fully answer your question, but give you partial hunches, I guess.
I'm curious then, picking up again on something you said, Mary-Eve, did you guys, or did the JBC, did you think about how, or kind of the difference between the ways in which French Canadian and English Canadians have remembered Dieppe at all?
That would have required an extra 1,500 meters of space. I've hinted at a couple of moments in my presentation that we discovered. And I think, Béatrice Richard has done some work on that, the propaganda and the effect on Quebec. But it's not something that we chose to display at great length. It's mentioned in passing, and it's mentioned that it was a divisive issue, and in that we keep European visitors in mind who might not necessarily be equipped with all the know how to navigate these existential, considerations we have as Canadians with our two solitudes. We thought about it, but not enough space to mention it more than in passing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's always the challenge, right? Is trying to fit everything you want into an exhibit. I can only speak from it from writing, but I'm sure it's a similarly painful process of having to chop something that you love so much.
Yeah.
Next question. I think we'll probably have time for maybe 2 more questions, Mary-Eve, depending on how long we go on to answer these questions, but we'll aim for 2 more and see where we go from there. This first one comes from Bonnie McKenzie. She's curious if you have ever come across any kind of recognition or acknowledgement of there being some sort of errors in judgment as on part of the British Strategic Command in planning for Dieppe.
We didn't dive into showcasing that aspect that much in the exhibition. I think there's one quote that we use by Cecil Merritt, who won the VC, obviously, as everyone knows, and he says, "To hell with the story of the generals doing us dirt. We were happy to go and we went in." Like I'm paraphrasing the quote, but it's a famous one. I think everyone knows it. That's the extent to which we dive into that vein of, he just says to hell with it. And I think that there's obviously errors in judgment, like especially with regards to topography. That's something that is contentious still, like how come the English who used to go on vacation in Dieppe, it's a popular vacation spot, would have overlooked and such, prominent cliffs and misjudged that a couple of machine guns could mow down an entire brigade, well, exaggerating, but not that much.
I'll perhaps combine a few questions to wrap things up, Mary-Eve. First of all, there's a question from someone, and I can't find it in here. I might have accidentally dismissed it. If there's going to be a booklet or something that people might be able to purchase about the exhibit, if the JBC has any plans to publish something in regards to this exhibit.
Oh God, we wish we had the bandwidth to do that. Alex, do you want to tackle that with me? That would be great. We've always dreamt of having the time and resources to publish an exhibition catalogs for every exhibition we've ever done, and we end up never having so that's a great project, and maybe we'll hire a summer student to tackle that. It would be great. I think it would be worthwhile. It's a really popular exhibition so far, and co-written by Alex and myself. We devoted, we poured our hearts and souls into it. But the resource that I was pointing at earlier, well, at the end of my presentation, is probably the closest thing we have to an exhibition catalog. It's basically, it stems from the exhibition, the educational resource that's on our website that I showcased.
And I'm putting it in the chat right now for people to visit.
Great.
So yeah, if you are interested in learning more about the exhibit and other kind of Dieppe materials that the JBC has, just follow that link that I just sent to you in the chat, and you can look around there. Last question for you, Mary-Eve. Are there any specific ceremonies or anything that's going to be happening on the 19th of August to commemorate Dieppe that those that are traveling to Europe in the next week or so might be able to attend?
Yes, we have a ceremony for the 80th anniversary of the Dieppe Raid at the Juno Beach Centre on the 19th itself. And we have a ceremony on the 20th as well. So yeah, we've got our newsletter just went out with everything that we're doing domestically, especially, well, you actually talked about it at the beginning of the presentation. We have the postcard campaign that we're hoping will be a success. Yeah.
I think the postcard campaign is such a great idea on your guys' part. So great job. I'm really excited to hear some of the testimonies from people that have received some of the postcards. I'm sure you'll be posting on social media in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, we are too. It's exciting. That's the best part, waiting to see if people turn up. Absolutely.
Well, Mary-Eve, I just want to say, thanks again for so generously giving your time this evening to us. I think it gave us a really great idea of what the Juno Beach Centre's new exhibit on Dieppe looks like, some of the things that you guys were thinking through when putting together this exhibit. And I hope that folks that are making the trip over to France will get a chance to stop by and take a look at it. I think it's a temporary exhibit, but it's up until the end of 2023, right?
Yes, December 2023.
That's right. So folks, you guys can go in and check it out anytime before December 2023. I guess moving forwards then, our sixth and final event in the Maple Leaf Route webinar series this summer. I can't believe we're already at the end, 6 events. It's unbelievable. This sixth and final event will take place on the 31st of August at our usual time slot at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Stacey Barker from the Canadian War Museum will speak about the experiences of women during the Second World War, continuing on with our talks or our last 3 webinars on the social history of the war. Now, when you close Zoom tonight, you will be directed to our registration page for the Maple Leaf Route webinar series, and it's there that you can register for Stacey's upcoming talk at the end of August. If you enjoyed tonight's webinar and would like to know more about what is happening at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada, whether it's webinars such as this, publications, conferences, podcasts, again, that same page that you're going to be directed to once you exit the Zoom window tonight, just scroll down to the bottom of the page, enter in your name and email, and from there you'll get periodic emails from us letting you know of things that are going on at the center that might be of interest to you. Now, before I let you all go, I actually have an exciting announcement. Unless public health measures change, we are planning to return to in-person lectures in September. Our first speaker will be our very own Terry Kopp, who will be speaking about his newest book, Montreal at War, 1914 to 1918. For those who are too far away to attend, don't worry. We will continue to be broadcasting these talks virtually. So for anyone who is either too far away or isn't able to attend, who is maybe in the Kitchener-Waterloo region, these talks will, moving forwards, always be available to you online. Aside from that, I just want to say thanks one more time to Mary-Eve for an excellent presentation. Thanks to you all for attending tonight's webinar, and we hope to see you back again in 3 weeks for the final webinar in the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. Take care, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.